If kindness always comes with a price, why was Emily Carter still willing to pay it? The question drifted through her mind as another sharp cough stole the warmth from her chest, leaving her standing alone beside the tiny wooden table that held the last glass bottle of medicine she would ever own. Outside, the winter wind swept across Frost Hollow, rattling the loose shutters of her cabin and covering the narrow trail with another layer of fresh snow. The tiny settlement slept beneath a silver sky, unaware that one forgotten Omega was quietly counting the days until her strength finally disappeared. Emily traced her fingers across the cool bottle, watching the pale herbal liquid catch the glow of the oil lamp. It was barely enough for one final treatment. The village healer had warned her only yesterday. Without it, her illness would become harder to fight, and the bitter mountain cold would show no mercy. She understood. She simply hadn't told anyone. There was no one left who truly cared enough to ask. 3 years had passed since the alpha chosen by her pack had publicly rejected her, and ever since then, Emily had become little more than a shadow moving through familiar streets. People accepted her work but avoided her eyes. They praised strength but overlooked quiet compassion. Every morning she gathered herbs for others, stitched torn blankets, and left fresh bread at the doors of elderly neighbors who never learned where it came from. They thanked fate for unexpected blessings, never imagining the rejected Omega was the one leaving them behind. Emily smiled anyway. Kindness had become the only thing no one could take from her. She lifted the medicine bottle carefully, hesitating as she whispered, "Tomorrow." If she waited until sunrise, perhaps she could stretch its strength long enough to survive another week. The thought offered little comfort, but it was enough. Then came 3 slow knocks against the front door. They were so soft they almost disappeared beneath the howl of the wind. Emily froze. No one visited her cabin after dark. Another knock followed, weaker this time, then silence. She wrapped her faded gray shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. Snowflakes drifted through the moonlight like scattered feathers. The freezing air caught in her lungs as she looked toward the porch. A man lay collapsed near the wooden steps, his dark coat dusted with snow, one gloved hand still reaching toward the door as though determination alone had carried him this far. His face was partly hidden beneath frost-covered hair, but even in the pale light, she noticed something unusual. Despite exhaustion, there was dignity in the way he had fallen, as if even hardship could not bend whatever quiet strength lived inside him. Emily hurried closer and knelt beside him. His breathing was shallow, his skin cold from the storm, and the faint scent of pine mixed with winter frost clung to his coat. He was clearly a traveler, though nothing about him suggested an ordinary one. A silver emblem shaped like a wolf had nearly slipped beneath the edge of his cloak before disappearing again. Emily reached for the medicine bottle still resting in the pocket of her shawl. Her fingers tightened around the glass until they trembled. This bottle was meant to keep her alive. If she gave it away tonight, there might not be another chance. The wind answered with another lonely howl as she looked from the stranger's peaceful face to the tiny bottle in her hand. Closing her eyes for only a heartbeat, Emily whispered the words no one else would ever hear. "If saving you means I won't see spring, then I hope your tomorrow is worth my today." Emily uncorked the small glass bottle with hands that refused to stay steady. The familiar scent of pine needles, wild mint, and bitter root rose into the quiet room, reminding her how many cold mornings it had taken to gather every fragile ingredient along frozen hillsides. Months of work rested inside a bottle small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. Without allowing herself another moment to hesitate, she poured a clean cloth into a shallow bowl, mixed every remaining drop with warm spring water, and gently pressed it against the stranger's forehead. His breathing remained uneven, but the deep lines of strain across his face slowly softened. Emily added fresh logs to the fireplace until gentle warmth spread through the tiny cabin. She removed his snow-covered gloves and heavy coat, careful not to disturb him more than necessary. Beneath the thick fabric, she noticed simple traveling clothes, worn but surprisingly well made. Whoever he was, he had traveled far through the mountains alone. She filled a small kettle, brewed the last of her dried elderflower tea, and waited. The hours slipped quietly into the night. Outside, the wind continued to circle the cabin like an endless song, but inside only the crackling fire and the stranger's breathing filled the silence. Emily found herself studying his face from across the room. Even exhausted, there was something calm about him, something disciplined. His hands were rough from years of work rather than luxury, yet every movement he made, even while unconscious, carried unusual confidence. She could not explain why, but she felt strangely safe sitting beside someone she had never met. Just before dawn, the stranger's eyes slowly opened. They were an unmistakable shade of silver, clear despite his weakness, reflecting the firelight like moonlight resting on fresh snow. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Then his gaze drifted toward the empty medicine bottle resting beside the bowl. He understood immediately. "You used it," he said quietly, his voice rough from exhaustion. Emily offered a gentle smile. "You needed it more than I did." A shadow crossed his expression. "You do not even know who I am." She lowered her eyes toward the dying fire. "No, but I know someone was knocking on my door instead of giving up." That was enough. Silence settled between them once again. It was not uncomfortable. It felt strangely familiar, as though two lonely souls had briefly found shelter from the same storm. The stranger slowly reached inside his coat and withdrew a small silver coin unlike any Emily had ever seen. One side carried the image of a full moon. The other bore the head of a wolf surrounded by ancient markings she did not recognize. He placed it carefully into her hand and gently folded her fingers around it. "Keep this," he said. "If anyone ever asks where you found it, tell them a traveler repaid a debt that could never truly be repaid." Emily looked at the unusual coin before raising her eyes again. "I did not help you for payment." A faint smile touched his face for the first time. It softened the quiet strength that surrounded him and made him appear almost ordinary. "I know. That is exactly why you deserve it." He rose slowly from the chair beside the fire. Although traces of weariness remained, his posture had become noticeably stronger, as though the warmth of the cabin had returned more than simple comfort. Emily walked him to the front door as the first pale light of morning painted the snowy hills beyond Frost Hollow. Before stepping outside, he paused and looked back at her with an expression she would remember long after this day faded into memory. "There are people who believe power changes the world," he said softly. "They are wrong. One act of mercy can change a life forever." Then he disappeared into the white morning, leaving only footprints stretching toward the distant mountains and a silver coin resting quietly inside Emily's trembling hand. The silver coin remained tucked inside the pocket of Emily's shawl, growing warmer against her side with every passing day, although she never once considered spending it. It felt less like money and more like a promise she could not explain. Life, however, refused to change simply because a stranger had crossed her path. By the third morning after the storm, the familiar ache had returned to her chest with greater force than before. Every breath reminded her that the medicine was gone, and every step through the snow required a little more determination than the last. Still, she rose before sunrise, gathered firewood for the elderly widow at the edge of town, delivered fresh bread to the retired blacksmith whose hands had become too weak to bake, and stopped by the small chapel to leave bundles of dried herbs for families who could not afford them. No one saw her. No one thanked her. They simply accepted each quiet gift as another fortunate coincidence. When Emily entered the village square carrying a basket of kindling, two young women from the pack exchanged knowing smiles before one of them spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "There goes the rejected Omega who gives everything away. Perhaps generosity is easier when no one chooses you." Soft laughter followed. Emily lowered her eyes and continued walking without answering. She had learned long ago that silence often protected dignity better than arguments ever could. Even so, the words settled quietly inside her heart. That afternoon, she visited the healer, hoping perhaps another shipment of mountain herbs had arrived before the roads froze completely. The elderly woman behind the counter sighed before Emily even asked the question. "Nothing yet," she said gently. "The passes are closed. It may be weeks before supplies reach Frost Hollow." Emily nodded with a grateful smile despite the disappointment. "Thank you anyway." As she turned to leave, another customer whispered, believing she could not hear. "She wasted her last bottle on a stranger." Foolish people always mistake kindness for wisdom. Emily stepped back into the cold without looking behind her. Snowflakes drifted lazily across the empty street, while distant church bells echoed through the valley. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and reached instinctively into her pocket, touching the edge of the silver coin. For a brief moment, she wondered who the traveler truly was. Had he reached safety? Had he found his family? Did he even remember the small cabin hidden among the pines? She smiled to herself before quietly dismissing the thought. Some people entered another person's life only long enough to remind them that goodness still existed. That evening, as darkness settled over Frost Hollow, a group of merchants arrived from the northern trade road seeking warmth before continuing south. The entire village gathered around the inn, eager to hear fresh news from beyond the mountains. Emily remained near the edge of the crowd, unnoticed as always, while one gray-haired merchant shared stories from distant kingdoms. The royal capital has been in an uproar for days, he announced. The Alpha King disappeared during a secret journey through the northern wilderness. Some feared he had been lost in the storm itself. Curious whispers spread through the crowd. Another merchant quickly added, "They say he returned alive without explaining how he survived." Since then, royal riders have been leaving the capital in every direction. They are searching for someone. The listeners exchanged puzzled looks. "Someone important?" a farmer asked. The merchant shrugged. "No one knows. Only that the king himself ordered the search, and every rider carries the same command. Find the person who saved his life." Emily listened quietly for another moment before turning away. The words sounded like the beginning of one of the old bedtime legends her mother had once loved to tell. Surely they had nothing to do with a forgotten Omega living alone at the edge of Frost Hollow. She walked home beneath a sky filled with silent stars, never noticing that the silver coin resting in her pocket reflected the moonlight with a glow that had not been there before. The first light of dawn spilled across the towering walls of Blackstone Citadel, turning the frost-covered battlements into ribbons of silver, yet the palace itself remained unusually quiet. Servants walked softly through marble corridors, royal guards stood straighter than usual, and every member of the king's council wore the same expression of restrained concern. At the center of it all stood Alpha King Alexander Hayes, gazing through the enormous windows overlooking the snow-covered valley below. His dark traveling cloak had been replaced with the deep midnight blue mantle of the crown, embroidered with the ancient crest of the Northern Kingdom, but his silver eyes carried the same thoughtful calm they had held inside a forgotten cabin only days before. Lord Bennet Ashcroft, the king's oldest advisor, entered the chamber carrying a stack of reports gathered from every province. He stopped several feet away before speaking carefully. "Your Majesty, the council requests today's military briefing." Alexander did not turn around. "Reschedule it." Bennet hesitated. "The governors have already arrived. They can wait." The answer came gently, yet no one in the kingdom questioned that tone. The advisor lowered his head. "As you wish." Several moments passed before Alexander finally spoke again. "Have the scouts found her?" Bennet already knew whom the king meant. "Not yet, Your Majesty. The storm erased most of the tracks, and the northern villages are scattered across hundreds of miles." Alexander nodded once, though disappointment briefly crossed his face. "Then expand the search." Bennet stepped closer, unable to hide his curiosity any longer. "Forgive me, Your Majesty, but every captain in the royal guard is searching for one unknown woman. Rumors have begun spreading through every territory. Some believe she is a noble. Others think she possesses ancient magic." Alexander finally turned toward him, his expression softer than anyone inside the palace had seen in years. "Neither rumor is true." He looked toward the fireplace, remembering a tiny cabin filled with warmth despite its simple walls, a quiet smile offered without expectation, and a pair of gentle hands placing the last bottle of precious medicine into the care of a complete stranger. "She is simply kind." Bennet remained silent. He had served 3 generations of rulers, yet he had never heard a king describe anyone with such quiet admiration. Alexander continued, almost speaking to himself. "She did not ask my name. She did not ask for gold. She saw a man who needed help, and she chose compassion even though it cost her more than I deserved to receive." The room fell silent again before Alexander reached into his desk drawer and carefully removed an object wrapped in soft linen. Bennet recognized it immediately. It was an identical glass bottle to the one the royal physicians had recreated after studying the traces remaining inside the empty vial their king had carried back from the mountains. Weeks of research had gone into reproducing the rare herbal medicine. The finest healers in the kingdom had contributed their knowledge until they believed it surpassed the original. Alexander held the bottle carefully, as though it were made of crystal rather than glass. "She gave away her tomorrow so that I could have mine," he said quietly. "Now I intend to return both." At that very moment, the great doors opened once more as Captain Ethan Brooks of the Royal Guard entered with fresh reports gathered from the northern frontier. He knelt respectfully before rising. "Your Majesty, we have narrowed the search. Several travelers remember a small cabin near Frost Hollow occupied by a young Omega who lives alone." Alexander's eyes lifted instantly. "Her name?" Ethan glanced down at the parchment before answering. "Emily Carter." For the first time since returning to Blackstone Citadel, the weight that had rested quietly upon the king's shoulders seemed to lift. A gentle smile touched his face before he spoke words that immediately sent riders toward every northern road. "Prepare my horse. This time, I will thank her properly." Long before sunrise, riders wearing the silver crest of the Northern Crown spread across frozen roads like scattered stars, stopping in villages, trading posts, and mountain crossings with only one question on their lips. "Have you seen a young woman named Emily Carter?" The search puzzled everyone who heard it. Merchants guessed she must be a missing noblewoman. Hunters whispered that she possessed an ancient blessing. Children invented stories that the king was searching for a legendary healer hidden among the mountains. None of them imagined the truth was far simpler than any rumor. Emily, meanwhile, woke to another cold morning inside her little cabin, completely unaware that the most powerful men in the kingdom were following the path she had walked every day. She wrapped her faded shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the crisp air, carrying an empty basket for firewood. Her breathing remained shallow, and every few minutes she paused to steady herself before continuing along the familiar forest trail. Even weakened, she noticed the smallest signs of life around her. A pair of sparrows hopping across fresh snow, tiny rabbit tracks disappearing beneath pine branches, sunlight catching frozen streams until they shimmered like polished glass. Those quiet moments reminded her that hope often survived where no one bothered to look. By midday, she returned to Frost Hollow with enough wood for herself and 2 elderly neighbors. As she crossed the village square, Pack Elder Richard Holloway called her name. His voice carried the calm authority that caused nearby conversations to stop immediately. Emily approached respectfully. "Yes, Elder." He folded his hands behind his back before speaking. "You have received an offer." Emily blinked with quiet surprise. "An offer?" Richard nodded toward a broad-shouldered alpha standing several yards away beside the well. "Caleb Turner has requested permission to court you." Emily recognized him. Caleb owned one of the largest lumber businesses in the valley. He was respected, hardworking, and nearly 10 years older than she was. He stepped forward with measured confidence. "I know your past has not been easy," he said. "I can provide a comfortable home, warm meals, and protection. You will never struggle again." Around them, curious villagers gathered one by one, pretending to continue their daily chores while listening carefully. Emily appreciated Caleb's honesty, yet something inside her remained strangely still. She searched her heart for excitement, relief, even gratitude, but found only quiet uncertainty. She offered him a gentle smile. "You are generous, Caleb. Truly. But I cannot promise feelings that are not there." Caleb studied her face for several long seconds before giving a respectful nod. Although disappointment briefly crossed his expression, he accepted her answer without anger. "I understand," he replied. "I hope one day someone sees your heart the way I hope to." He walked away with dignity, leaving behind whispers that quickly spread through the square. "She refused him?" One woman murmured in disbelief. "She should have accepted," another answered. "An Omega with her reputation may never receive another chance." Emily heard every word, yet she quietly lifted her basket and continued home. She had already spent years being measured by other people's expectations. She no longer wished to build her future upon fear alone. That evening, the northern wind carried an unfamiliar sound across Frost Hollow. It was distant at first, little more than a rhythmic echo rolling through the valley. Emily stepped onto her porch and looked toward the winding road disappearing beyond the hills. Several villagers emerged from their homes, turning toward the same direction. The sound grew clearer with every passing minute. Horses, Not one or two, but many. Sunlight reflected against polished armor far beyond the tree line, creating brief flashes of silver between the pines. The village blacksmith shaded his eyes before whispering, "Royal riders." A hush settled over Frost Hollow. No one could remember the last time members of the Royal Guard had traveled this far north. Emily felt the silver coin resting inside her pocket as the approaching riders continued toward the village, their banners rising above the snowy road, while the quiet promise made inside her tiny cabin only days before began drawing closer with every heartbeat. The line of royal riders entered Frost Hollow with quiet precision, their polished armor reflecting the pale winter sun until the entire village seemed bathed in silver light. Every conversation stopped. Storekeepers stepped into their doorways. Children hid behind their parents. Even the village elders stood silently beside the square, unable to remember the last time the crown itself had crossed their forgotten valley. Emily remained near the edge of the crowd with her basket still resting against her arm. She assumed the royal delegation had arrived for official business, far beyond anything connected to her ordinary life. The lead rider slowly guided his magnificent black horse into the center of the square before bringing it to a graceful stop. A long midnight blue cloak settled over the horse's side as the man dismounted with calm confidence. Gasps spread through the crowd almost immediately. The silver wolf crest embroidered across his cloak could belong to only one person. Pack Elder Richard Holloway lowered his head first, followed by every villager around him. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully. Emily froze. Her eyes remained fixed on the familiar face, now standing only a few yards away. The traveler from the storm. The quiet stranger she had welcomed into her cabin. The man whose life she had saved with the last medicine she possessed. Her thoughts refused to catch up with what her eyes already knew. Alexander Hayes looked exactly as he had that winter morning, except now he carried the unmistakable presence of a ruler born to lead. His silver eyes searched the gathering until they found Emily standing silently at the edge of the square. A gentle smile touched his face. Without speaking to anyone else, he began walking toward her. The villagers exchanged confused glances as the Alpha King ignored the welcoming committee prepared by the elders. He passed respected merchants, village leaders, and decorated warriors without slowing his pace. Every step brought him closer to the one person no one else had ever considered important. Emily instinctively took a small step backward. "Your Majesty," she whispered, still struggling to believe what was happening. "I did not know." Alexander stopped before her, his expression filled not with royal authority, but with quiet gratitude. "I know," he answered softly. "That is why I came back." Before anyone could guess what would happen next, the king slowly lowered himself onto one knee in the snow. A wave of astonished whispers swept through the square. No one had ever witnessed the Alpha King kneel before an ordinary citizen, much less a rejected Omega whom the village had overlooked for years. Emily's eyes widened in disbelief. "Please, you do not have to do this," she said, her voice trembling. Alexander looked up at her with complete sincerity. "Yes, I do." He carefully opened a small wooden case, carried by Captain Ethan Brooks, and lifted out a crystal bottle filled with shimmering golden medicine. The liquid glowed softly in the winter sunlight, far clearer and purer than the simple remedy Emily had sacrificed days before. "The finest healers in my kingdom recreated this for you," Alexander said. Every herb was gathered from the royal gardens and the northern mountains. Every physician worked until it was worthy of the woman who gave away her own chance to recover so that a stranger could live. Emily stared silently at the bottle, unable to find words. Alexander gently placed it into her hands before continuing. "You gave me your tomorrow without asking my name. Today I return yours." Tears quietly filled Emily's eyes as she held the warm glass against her palms. Around them, the same villagers who had questioned her kindness only hours before stood speechless, watching the king honor the woman they had failed to appreciate. No crown could have made Alexander appear greater in that moment than the humility with which he chose to repay a debt of compassion, and no title could have made Emily appear more extraordinary than the quiet grace with which she had shown mercy to someone she believed was simply a stranger knocking on her door. Silence lingered over Frost Hollow long after Alexander rose to his feet. No one seemed willing to breathe too loudly, as though even the smallest sound might shatter the unbelievable moment they had just witnessed. Emily carefully held the crystal bottle against her chest, still unable to understand why the king himself had crossed half the kingdom simply to return her kindness. She looked into his calm, silver eyes and finally found the courage to ask the question that had quietly rested in her heart since the day he disappeared into the snow. "Why were you alone that night?" Alexander glanced across the gathered villagers before answering, his voice steady enough for everyone to hear. "I was traveling without my royal escort because I wanted to see my kingdom through the eyes of ordinary people. Titles often hide the truth. A crown can prevent a ruler from seeing the lives of those he is meant to protect." Curious whispers spread through the crowd. Alexander continued, "A sudden winter storm forced me away from the main road. By the time I reached this village, exhaustion had taken the last of my strength. I knocked on one door after another, but no one answered. Some were afraid. Some never heard me. Then I found a small cabin with a single light still burning." Emily lowered her eyes, remembering the lonely knock that had changed everything. Alexander smiled gently. "The woman living there did not ask whether I was rich or poor. She did not ask where I came from. She simply opened the door." He turned toward the villagers surrounding the square. "When I regained consciousness, I saw an empty medicine bottle beside the fire. I later learned from the royal physicians that the herbs inside had been extremely rare, especially during winter. The healer who prepared the replacement told me something I will never forget. Whoever gave me that medicine almost certainly gave away her only chance to recover." A heavy silence settled over the crowd. Several villagers slowly lowered their heads, remembering every careless word they had spoken about Emily only days before. The elderly healer stepped forward with tears shining in her eyes. "He is telling the truth," she admitted quietly. "Emily never told anyone how serious her condition had become. She used the last treatment I could prepare before the mountain passes closed." Emily looked surprised. "I did not want anyone to worry," she said softly. Alexander turned back toward her, genuine admiration warming his expression. "You protected the peace of others while carrying your own burden alone. That kind of strength cannot be measured by titles or rank." Captain Ethan Brooks stepped forward holding a folded parchment sealed with the royal crest. Alexander accepted it before speaking once more. "My council advised me to reward the woman who saved my life with gold, land, or jewels." He looked directly at Emily and slowly shook his head. They misunderstood what happened. Compassion is not a service that can be purchased after the fact. It deserves respect, not payment. He carefully tucked the sealed parchment back beneath his arm. "The reward I have prepared will be announced when the proper time arrives. But before any proclamation is made, there is something every person here deserves to know." He faced the villagers again, his voice calm, yet carrying unmistakable authority across the silent square. "The greatest act of courage I witnessed during my journey did not come from a warrior carrying a sword or a noble wearing fine clothing. It came from a rejected Omega living alone in a small wooden cabin who believed a stranger's life mattered as much as her own." Emily felt warmth rise to her face as countless eyes turned toward her with expressions completely different from those she had known for years. There was no ridicule left among them, only quiet reflection. For the first time since fate had separated her from the future she once imagined, she did not feel invisible. She simply stood beneath the winter sky holding a bottle of hope in one hand and a silver coin in the other, unaware that the greatest surprise of all had not yet revealed itself. The winter air remained perfectly still, as though even the wind had paused to witness what would happen next. Emily stood quietly before Alexander, the crystal bottle resting securely in her hands while the small silver coin remained hidden inside her pocket. She had expected the king to thank her and continue his journey back to the capital. Instead, he seemed in no hurry to leave. His gaze lingered on her with a quiet familiarity that neither of them fully understood. Then something unusual happened. The silver coin suddenly grew warm beneath the fabric of Emily's shawl. She instinctively touched her pocket, surprised by the gentle heat spreading across her fingertips. At that exact moment, the wolf-shaped clasp fastening Alexander's royal cloak reflected a soft silver glow. Several members of the royal guard exchanged puzzled glances. Captain Ethan Brooks looked toward the king's advisor, Lord Bennet Ashcroft, whose expression slowly shifted from curiosity to astonishment. Bennett took one careful step forward before speaking almost in a whisper. "Your Majesty, the Moonstone Crest." Alexander looked down and noticed the ancient emblem shining brighter with every heartbeat. He frowned slightly before lifting his eyes toward Emily. The warmth surrounding them continued to grow, gentle rather than overwhelming, like the first sunlight after a long winter. Emily slowly removed the silver coin from her pocket. The engraved wolf that had appeared ordinary only moments earlier now shimmered beneath the daylight, revealing delicate symbols that had remained invisible until now. Tiny rays of silver light stretched from the coin toward Alexander's cloak before fading into the crisp mountain air. The gathered villagers watched in complete silence. None of them had ever seen anything like it. Bennett lowered his head respectfully before addressing the crowd. "The Moonstone Crest has served the royal bloodline for centuries," he explained quietly. "According to our oldest records, it responds only when a bond has been formed through extraordinary selflessness and absolute trust. It has awakened only a handful of times in our kingdom's history." Emily looked at Alexander with confusion. "I do not understand," she admitted softly. Alexander smiled with the same gentle warmth she remembered from the little cabin. "Neither do I," he answered honestly. "But perhaps some things are meant to be discovered rather than explained." The elderly healer stepped closer, studying the glowing coin with careful eyes. "Kindness has a way of revealing truths that pride can never uncover," she said. "Perhaps this is not about destiny choosing greatness. Perhaps it is about greatness recognizing kindness." Her words settled over the square like falling snow. For the first time, the villagers did not see Emily as the rejected Omega who lived alone beyond the trees. They saw the woman whose compassion had reached farther than status, fear, or expectation. Caleb Turner quietly stepped forward from the crowd. He placed one hand over his heart before offering Emily a respectful nod. "I told you that I hoped someone would see your heart," he said with a sincere smile. "I did not realize the first person to truly see it would be the king himself." Emily returned the smile gratefully, touched by his kindness. Alexander watched the exchange with quiet admiration before speaking once more. "The strongest kingdoms are not built by powerful rulers alone," he said. "They endure because ordinary people choose compassion when no one is watching." His words reached every corner of Frost Hollow, and for many standing there, they carried more weight than any royal decree ever could. As the afternoon sun slowly descended behind the snow-covered pines, the silver glow faded from the coin and the royal crest alike, leaving behind only quiet wonder and a question no one present could answer. If one simple act of mercy had already changed the fate of a forgotten village, what future might still be waiting for the humble Omega and the king whose lives had become forever connected by the choice she made on a lonely winter night? As the last traces of silver light disappeared from the Moonstone Crest and the ancient coin, a peaceful silence settled over Frost Hollow unlike anything the village had ever known. No one hurried back to work. No one whispered another careless judgment. Instead, every eye remained fixed on the young woman they had overlooked for years. Emily lowered her gaze, uncomfortable with so much attention, because she had never performed a single kind act hoping someone would notice. She had simply believed that every life mattered, even when her own seemed forgotten. Alexander understood that quiet humility better than anyone standing in the square. He stepped forward once more, unfolding the royal parchment he had carried since leaving Blackstone Citadel. Breaking the crimson wax seal, he looked first at Emily before turning toward the villagers. "By the authority entrusted to me as Alpha King of the Northern Kingdom," he announced, his calm voice carrying across the snow-covered rooftops, "I declare Emily Carter an honored guardian of the crown, a title granted only to those whose compassion has preserved the future of this kingdom." A wave of astonishment swept through the crowd. Such recognition had traditionally been reserved for individuals whose courage had changed countless lives. Yet no one protested. After everything they had witnessed, the honor felt completely deserved. Alexander continued, "This title carries no obligation, no command, and no expectation. It is simply our kingdom's promise that the woman who once stood alone will never stand alone again." Emily's eyes filled with quiet tears. For so many years, she had believed her greatest acts of kindness had vanished unnoticed into the cold winter air. Now she realized that goodness had never truly disappeared. It had simply traveled farther than she could see. Pack Elder Richard Holloway slowly stepped forward, his shoulders heavy with regret. Before the entire village, he bowed respectfully to Emily. "I failed to see your worth," he admitted. "As your elder, I should have protected every member of this pack equally. Instead, I allowed silence to become another form of injustice. I ask for your forgiveness." Emily looked at the man who had once seemed so distant. She could have answered with bitterness. She could have reminded everyone of every lonely winter, every whispered insult, and every door that had remained closed. Instead, she smiled with the same quiet warmth that had welcomed a stranger into her cabin. "If kindness changed my life," she said gently, "perhaps forgiveness can change someone else's." The words settled deeply into every heart present. Even those who had once laughed at her found themselves lowering their eyes, ashamed not because the king had witnessed their mistakes, but because Emily had answered them with grace instead of resentment. Alexander watched her with unmistakable admiration. More than once during his journey, he had wondered whether the kingdom needed stronger walls, larger armies, or greater wealth. Standing beside Emily, he finally understood what his people needed most. They needed examples of quiet goodness that inspired others to become better than they had been yesterday. As the afternoon slowly gave way to evening, Alexander extended his hand toward Emily, not as a command from a ruler, but as an invitation between equals. She accepted it with a grateful smile, and together they walked through the village square while children waved excitedly and neighbors greeted her by name for the first time in years. Above them, the first stars appeared across the winter sky, shining with quiet certainty over a village forever changed by one simple decision made on a lonely night. Emily had believed she was giving away her last chance at tomorrow when she shared her medicine with a stranger. Instead, she discovered that true kindness never leaves a person empty. It returns in ways no one can predict, transforming not only a single life, but every heart willing to believe that real strength is gentle, compassion is never wasted, and sometimes the smallest act of mercy becomes the beginning of an extraordinary destiny.